It was a quiet morning in the small town of Palo Alto, California, where the echoes of students laughing and chatting in the hallways of the local high school filled the air. This was a place that had seen countless teenagers walk through its doors, each of them carrying their own dreams, their own stories. But on this particular day, something entirely unexpected was about to unfold, a moment that would change everything. Elon Musk, a name that had become synonymous with innovation, success, and the future itself, was walking through the very hallways of his high school. But this wasn't just another visit from a famous alumnus. Elon wasn't here for a tech talk or a charity event. No, today he had a much more personal mission in mind. As Elon made his way toward the janitor's closet, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had walked these halls many years ago, before the SpaceX rockets, before the electric cars, before the billions. Back then, he was just a skinny kid with big dreams and a hunger for knowledge. But there was one person who had been there for him, watching from the sidelines as he and countless other students came and went, Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry was the school janitor. To most people, he was just the quiet man who swept the floors, cleaned the classrooms, and made sure everything was in order. But to Elon, Mr. Henry was something more. He was a constant presence in his life during the toughest years of his youth. While others saw the janitor as just a figure in the background, Elon saw him as a silent mentor, a man who was always there, offering a kind word or a smile when things seemed too difficult. And now, after all these years, Elon had come back to give something to the man who had shaped his life in ways that he could never fully articulate. Mr. Henry, Elon thought to himself as he approached the janitor's closet, his heart racing. You won't believe what's about to happen. The door to the closet creaked open, and there, hunched over a mop, was the man himself, Mr. Henry. His hair was thin and gray, his back a little more bent than Elon remembered, but his eyes still sparkled with the same warmth and kindness that had left a lasting impression on Elon all those years ago. Mr. Henry looked up in surprise. His weathered face broke into a smile. Well, if it isn't Elon Musk. What are you doing here, son? He asked, his voice as familiar as ever. Elon smiled back, trying to keep his emotions in check. He stepped forward, his voice a little shaky as he replied, I've been thinking a lot about this place lately, Mr. Henry. About all the people who helped me along the way, and you've always stood out in my mind. The old janitor chuckled. I'm just a guy with a broom, Elon. You don't have to thank me for anything. But Elon shook his head. No, you don't understand. You were there when I needed someone. And I've come to return the favor. Mr. Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. Return the favor? What do you mean? Elon took a deep breath. This was it. The moment he'd been planning for weeks, the moment he knew would change Mr. Henry's life forever. Mr. Henry, I'm here to give you something. Something that I think you deserve, more than anyone else I know, Elon said. I've been fortunate in ways that you can't even imagine. And because of that, I've been able to do a lot of things that have changed the world. But none of it would have been possible without you, and I want to make sure you know just how much that means to me. Mr. Henry stood up slowly, his hands still gripping the mop. He looked at Elon, eyes wide with disbelief. What are you talking about, Elon? You've done more than enough. I've watched you on TV, seen all your interviews. You don't need to be giving me anything. Elon smiled, his eyes softening with emotion. I think you'll see why I'm doing this in a moment. You've been working here for nearly 50 years, Mr. Henry. And while you've always been here for everyone else, I think it's time someone was here for you. The janitor took a step back, his face filled with confusion. Elon, you're making no sense, son. I'm just an old man. I've had my time. What could you possibly have for me? Just trust me, Elon said gently. You'll find out soon enough. Come with me. Mr. Henry hesitated for a moment, but then nodded slowly, still unsure of what was happening. The two men walked together out of the janitor's closet, down the familiar hallways that seemed to have stood still in time. They walked past classrooms where the hum of students' voices could be heard faintly, and finally out into the parking lot, where a black SUV was waiting. Elon opened the door for Mr. Henry, motioning for him to get inside. "Come on, let's take a little ride. I promise you'll understand soon." Mr. Henry looked from the car to Elon, then back at the school. "What is this? What's going on, Elon?" But Elon just smiled. "It's a surprise, Mr. Henry. A surprise that I think you're going to like." As they drove through the town, Mr. Henry's face remained a mix of confusion and curiosity. He had no idea where they were going or what Elon had planned, but he trusted the young man, now an accomplished billionaire, who had once been just a student in his school. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, the car came to a stop in front of a large, modern building. Elon turned to Mr. Henry, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is it. I wanted to show you something that's going to change your life. And no, it's not a joke. This is real." Mr. Henry's eyes widened as he looked at the building. "What is this place, Elon?" Elon grinned. "This is your new home." The janitor's mouth dropped open. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "My new home?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elon, I don't understand." Elon turned to him, his tone now serious. "You've spent your life helping others, Mr. Henry. It's time for someone to help you. And that's exactly what I'm doing. You've earned it." The doors to the building opened, and they both stepped out of the car. As Mr. Henry looked around, still in shock, he realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that he never could have imagined. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon Musk wasn't always the billionaire tech mogul people knew today. In fact, the Elon Musk that walked into his old high school today was a far cry from the shy, awkward boy who had once sat in those very classrooms, unsure of his place in the world. His journey to becoming the founder of Tesla, SpaceX, and other groundbreaking companies had been anything but straightforward. It was filled with struggles, failures, and moments when even he wasn't sure if he'd make it. Born in Pretoria, South Africa, Elon's early life was marked by a deep sense of curiosity and a relentless drive to learn. His father, Elon Musk, was an engineer and a successful entrepreneur, while his mother, May Musk, was a model and dietitian. Elon's parents were intelligent and ambitious, but their relationship was strained, and Elon often found himself caught in the middle of their conflicts. This turbulent home environment left him feeling isolated, but it also fueled his desire to prove himself. From a young age, Elon demonstrated an incredible aptitude for technology, particularly when it came to computers. At the age of 12, he coded a video game called Blaster, which he sold to a computer magazine for $500. It was a small sum, but for Elon, it was the beginning of a lifelong obsession with innovation and entrepreneurship. By the time he was in high school, Elon had developed an insatiable hunger for knowledge, particularly in physics and engineering. But despite his intelligence, he often struggled with fitting in. He was the new kid in school, frequently moving from one place to another due to his parents' divorce and other family issues. He wasn't a natural at making friends, and his classmates often made fun of him for his awkward demeanor and intense focus on his studies. In high school, Elon attended Waterkloof House Preparatory School and then Pretoria Boys High School. It was during these years that his passion for learning really began to take shape. While other kids were out playing sports or hanging out with friends, Elon was buried in books about science and technology, devouring any information he could get his hands on. His classmates didn't understand his obsession, and he often felt like an outsider. But there was one place he found solace: the school library. It was there, among the shelves filled with books, that Elon began to map out his future. His dreams were big, sometimes too big for others to grasp. He dreamed of colonizing Mars, revolutionizing transportation with electric vehicles, and creating sustainable energy solutions. But at the time, those dreams seemed impossibly far-fetched. It wasn't until he moved to Canada at 17 and later to the United States to attend the University of Pennsylvania that Elon began to see the glimmer of possibility for turning his dreams into reality. Despite his incredible intellect, Elon's college years were not without their challenges. His first year at Queen's University in Ontario was marked by a sense of uncertainty. He was still figuring out who he was and what he wanted to do with his life. But it was also during this time that he began to realize that his passion wasn't just for technology, it was for solving problems that could change the world. This realization would drive him for the rest of his life. After 2 years at Queen's, Elon transferred to the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, where he pursued 2 degrees, one in physics from the College of Arts and Sciences and another in economics from the Wharton School of Business. It was there that Elon's vision began to crystallize. He understood that if he was going to make a real impact on the world, he needed to think big. He wasn't just interested in making money, he wanted to build things that would change the course of humanity's future. After graduating, Elon moved to Silicon Valley, where he launched his first venture, Zip2, a software company that helped newspapers establish an online presence. It was his first taste of success, and it wasn't long before he sold the company to Compaq for nearly $300 million. But rather than resting on his laurels, Elon used the money to fund his next big project, X.com, which would eventually become PayPal. The success of PayPal made him a millionaire, but even that wasn't enough to satisfy his burning desire to solve the world's most pressing problems. It was during this period that Elon's vision for the future really began to take shape. He sold PayPal to eBay for $1.5 billion and, with that money, embarked on his journey to revolutionize the space and automotive industries. First, there was SpaceX, a private space exploration company with the lofty goal of making space travel affordable and eventually colonizing Mars. Then came Tesla, which aimed to make electric cars mainstream and push the world toward sustainable energy. Through it all, Elon never forgot where he came from. He knew that every step of his journey had been shaped by the people he met along the way. And one of those people was Mr. Henry, the school janitor who had been there for him when no one else was. When he thought back to his high school years, Elon could still picture Mr. Henry, with his gruff exterior and gentle soul, always offering a kind word or a listening ear. It was a kindness that had left an indelible mark on Elon, and it was that kindness that drove him to come back to his old high school and offer Mr. Henry the gift of a lifetime. As Elon reflected on the years that had passed, he realized just how much he had changed. But there was one thing that had remained constant, his appreciation for the people who had helped him along the way. And that was why he was here today. To give something back. The town of Palo Alto was a place that had shaped Elon in so many ways. It was where he had dreamed big, struggled with his self-confidence, and found inspiration in unexpected places. And now, as he stood in front of Mr. Henry, he realized that this was his chance to return the favor. It wasn't just about giving Mr. Henry a gift, it was about showing him that his life, his sacrifices, had mattered. It was about acknowledging the quiet heroes who had helped shape Elon's path, people like Mr. Henry, who had always been there, even when it seemed like no one else was. As the two men sat in the quiet car, heading toward the new home that Elon had prepared for him, Elon couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. For once, he wasn't just thinking about rockets or electric cars. He was thinking about the man who had made a difference in his life when he was just a kid trying to figure things out. And that was the moment Elon knew, this wasn't just about changing the world. It was about changing lives. As the black SUV rolled through the streets of Palo Alto, Mr. Henry sat silently in the passenger seat, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few minutes. A part of him was convinced that he was dreaming. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur who had reshaped the very fabric of modern society, had come back to his old high school. But it wasn't just a casual visit. It wasn't just to reminisce or to give a brief lecture. Elon was there to give him a gift, a gift that Mr. Henry couldn't begin to comprehend. "What's all this about, Elon?" Mr. Henry finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was thick with disbelief. "You're telling me this building is for me?" Elon glanced over, his eyes softening. "Yes, Mr. Henry. I know it's a lot to take in. But you've spent your life helping people, supporting us when we were just kids. Now, it's my turn to help you." Mr. Henry shook his head, still unable to grasp the enormity of what Elon was saying. "But I'm just an old janitor. I don't need all of this. A little extra help around here or there, sure, but a mansion. A place like this?" His voice faltered. "I don't deserve it. You've done so much already." Elon turned his attention back to the road, his jaw set in determination. "It's not about deserving it, Mr. Henry. It's about recognizing the value you brought to my life. You've been there when no one else was, and that means something. You may not think much of it, but what you did for me, it mattered." Mr. Henry couldn't respond. His eyes remained fixed out the window, but inside, a storm of conflicting emotions swirled. This was too much, too grand, too far removed from the reality he had known. For over 40 years, he had worked as the school janitor, quietly going about his job. He had no expectations of wealth or recognition. In fact, he'd always kept his head down, focusing on his work and maintaining a simple life. So when Elon, who had gone on to achieve unimaginable success, showed up with a life-changing offer, it was overwhelming. The car slowed as it approached the building Elon had brought him to. It wasn't a mansion in the traditional sense, but it certainly had the feel of something grand. Modern architecture, sleek glass windows, and an impressive front yard that could easily rival any luxury estate in the area. Mr. Henry felt a knot in his stomach. He could barely bring himself to look at it. "Here we are," Elon said, pulling into the driveway. "I've arranged everything, from the furniture to the staff. This is your new home, Mr. Henry." Mr. Henry opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. How could he accept this? He wasn't someone who needed a mansion, a team of staff, or the kind of life that Elon was offering. He had always been content with the little things, a warm cup of coffee in the morning, a good book in the evening, and the satisfaction of doing his job well. This grand gesture felt out of place in his humble world. As they stepped out of the car, the front door opened to reveal a woman in a neat uniform. She smiled warmly at Mr. Henry and introduced herself as Janet, the house manager. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Henry," she said. "We've been expecting you. Please, come inside." Mr. Henry hesitated at the doorstep. The interior of the house looked even more stunning than the exterior. Marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the living room was spacious and inviting, with large windows that let in the golden afternoon sunlight. It felt like a place for someone important, someone with power and wealth, not a school janitor who had never asked for anything in return. "I don't belong here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Elon turned to him, his expression serious. "Yes, you do. More than anyone else I know." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on Mr. Henry's chest. Then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. A tall man in a suit entered the foyer, introducing himself as the head of operations for the home's maintenance and services. "We have everything ready for you, Mr. Henry," he said with a professional smile. "Your needs will be taken care of. We'll make sure you're comfortable." But Mr. Henry couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It wasn't just the grand house or the staff awaiting his every command, it was the idea that he might somehow be a fraud in this world, living a life far beyond his means. He turned to Elon, his voice full of emotion. "I appreciate this, I really do. But it's too much. I'm not. I don't belong in a place like this. You've done so much already. I can't accept this." Elon stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Mr. Henry's shoulder. "Mr. Henry, I understand that this is a lot to process. But what I'm offering you is a chance to live a life of comfort, after years of giving so much to others. You've spent your entire life helping people like me. You deserve to enjoy something more. You deserve this, even if you don't see it yet. But what about everyone else? Mr. Henry replied, suddenly feeling a pang of guilt. What about the other janitors, the other people who work their whole lives but never get a chance at something like this? It doesn't seem fair. Elon's gaze softened. I know it's hard to see, but this isn't about fairness. It's about gratitude. And it's about making sure the people who helped me along the way don't go unnoticed. You didn't get recognition when you deserved it, and now I'm trying to make that right. It's not just for you, but for everyone who has helped and supported others without asking for anything in return. Mr. Henry looked down at his feet, his mind racing. This gift felt too big for him to comprehend. He had spent his life avoiding attention, working in the background, and here Elon was, offering him something beyond anything he had ever imagined. I just don't know, Mr. Henry muttered, unsure of how to process his emotions. Elon stood there, patient, letting the silence fill the room. It wasn't until the sound of birds chirping outside and the smell of fresh air through the open windows broke the tension that Mr. Henry looked up, his gaze softening. I'll give it a try, he finally said. But I still don't understand how this happened. Why me? Elon gave a quiet smile. Because, Mr. Henry, when I was struggling to find my way, you were there. You didn't ask for anything in return. You were just kind. And I've never forgotten that. That's why this matters so much. As Mr. Henry stepped into the house, he realized that this wasn't just about the house, or the staff, or even the money. It was about something deeper, a long overdue recognition, a quiet moment of gratitude, and the possibility of a new beginning. But the conflict within him still remained. Could he truly accept this new life, or was it too much of a stretch for someone who had lived so humbly for so long? The days that followed were a blur for Mr. Henry. It wasn't just the grandeur of the house that left him unsettled, though that in itself was overwhelming. It was the feeling of being thrust into a world that felt like it was meant for someone else. Every time he walked through the spacious hallways, past the fresh flowers arranged in elegant vases, or glanced at the sleek furniture that lined the living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. Yet, in a strange way, he also felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was more than he could ever have dreamed of. But it was more than just the house. It was everything Elon had done for him. The thought of a billionaire tech genius reaching out to him, the quiet janitor who had always just kept his head down, was something Mr. Henry still struggled to comprehend. Why him? It was a question that gnawed at him constantly. What had he done to deserve this? But even more pressing was the question of whether he could truly live in this new world Elon had presented to him. Could he really embrace the life of luxury that had been given to him, or was he destined to remain the humble man he had always been? One morning, as Mr. Henry sat in the bright, airy dining room, sipping his coffee, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Janet, the house manager, with a soft smile on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Henry. How are you feeling today?" she asked. He gave her a strained smile. "I'm doing fine, Janet. Just trying to get used to all of this." Janet chuckled softly. "I completely understand. It must be overwhelming. But remember, we're here to help you in any way we can. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Mr. Henry nodded but didn't say anything. He still wasn't sure how to ask for help. He had always been self-reliant, never accustomed to having people at his beck and call. It felt foreign, almost uncomfortable, to have so many people eager to cater to his every need. Later that day, Elon visited him again. The two of them sat on the patio, overlooking the sprawling gardens that surrounded the property. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the scene. "Elon, I'm grateful for all of this," Mr. Henry began, his voice thick with emotion. I truly am. But I don't know if I can live like this. It's too much. I've spent my whole life in that small apartment, working hard, doing what I know. But all of this feels like a dream I can't quite wake up from. Elon watched him closely, his expression unreadable. I get it, Mr. Henry. I really do. But you have to understand, you don't have to do anything differently. You don't have to change your life to fit into this new one. This place, it's for you to enjoy, not to make you feel like you have to become someone else. Mr. Henry was quiet for a long moment, still wrestling with the internal conflict that had been weighing on him. He wasn't used to being taken care of. The idea of relying on others, of being dependent on people to do everything for him, felt unnatural. I've spent my life making do with little, Mr. Henry said softly. I've never asked for anything extra. And now, here I am, in a place like this. It's hard to let go of the old me, the person who worked hard every day just to make sure everyone else was okay. I don't know how to just let someone else take care of me. Elon leaned forward, his voice calm and understanding. You don't have to change who you are, Mr. Henry. You've worked hard your whole life, taking care of everyone else. It's time someone took care of you for once. And I'm not asking you to become a different person. Just accept that you deserve this. You've earned it in ways that go beyond the money, the house, the staff. You've earned it by being a constant, dependable presence in the lives of others, like you were for me. Mr. Henry blinked, the weight of Elon's words hitting him. He had spent his entire life feeling like a small cog in a vast, indifferent machine. He had never seen himself as someone deserving of recognition, let alone something as grand as a luxury home. But the kindness Elon had shown him, the recognition he had never expected, was beginning to shift his perspective. That's the thing, Mr. Henry replied slowly. I never wanted recognition. I never asked for it. I was happy just doing my part. I know, Elon said, his eyes soft. And that's what makes what you did for me so special. You didn't do it for accolades. You did it because it was the right thing to do. But now, it's time to give back. A long silence stretched between them. Mr. Henry looked out over the lush garden, his mind wandering back to the days when he had cleaned those high school hallways, sweeping the floors and mopping the bathrooms, never asking for anything in return. He had done it because he believed in the importance of service, of being there for others when they needed it. Now, as he sat in a mansion that he could hardly believe was his, he realized that he had a choice to make. He could either embrace this new life, accept the gift that Elon had given him, and start living in a way he had never thought possible. Or he could reject it and return to the quiet life he had always known. But something inside him was changing. Maybe he didn't have to leave behind everything he had known. Maybe he could hold on to the man he had always been while also accepting the new opportunities that were being presented to him. I'm not sure if I'm ready for this, Mr. Henry admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I'll try. For you, Elon. I'll try to live a little differently. I'll try to accept that I deserve to be taken care of. Elon smiled, relief washing over his face. That's all I'm asking, Mr. Henry. Take it one day at a time. I'll be here to help, every step of the way. For the first time since he had arrived at the house, Mr. Henry felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this wasn't just a dream. Maybe this was a new beginning. A chance to live a life he had never thought possible, with the people who truly cared for him. As they sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mr. Henry made a decision. He would embrace this change, even if it felt uncomfortable. It was time to step into the unknown, to take a leap of faith. The days following Mr. Henry's decision to accept Elon's gift were a whirlwind of emotions. He still couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place in the extravagant house, and there were times when he found himself standing in front of the mirror, questioning if this was really his life now. It was as if he were living in someone else's skin, a suit that didn't quite fit. But deep down, he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in his life, he was allowing himself to be taken care of. It wasn't easy, though. Every time he walked into the kitchen and found Janet, or one of the other staff members, ready to serve him breakfast, he felt a strange discomfort. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. For decades, he had been the quiet observer, the one who helped behind the scenes. It felt unnatural to have people waiting on him. But as the days passed, something inside him began to shift. Slowly, the sense of discomfort started to fade. He wasn't just accepting the house, the staff, or the luxuries that came with it. He was beginning to understand what it meant to be cared for, truly cared for, in a way he had never experienced. One afternoon, after spending some time in the garden, Mr. Henry sat down with Elon in the living room, still unsure of the emotions stirring inside him. The weight of everything, the house, the staff, the gift, seemed to press on him at times, and the burden of it all felt heavier than he had anticipated. He had been trying to adapt, but there were moments when he wondered if it would ever truly feel like home. Elon, sensing the tension, took a deep breath and sat down beside him. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything all right?" Mr. Henry sighed, his hand running through his hair as he stared out the large windows. "I don't know. I don't know if I can get used to this. I mean, all of this, it feels like I'm living in a different world. I was just the janitor. I cleaned the floors, took out the trash, and did my job. That's all I knew." Elon's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Mr. Henry's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "I understand. It's a lot to take in. But what you've done for others, especially for me, can't be measured in just the work you did. It's about the way you made people feel. The care, the kindness. That's what made you invaluable to me, to all of us who were lucky enough to have known you." The words felt comforting, but they didn't make it any easier for Mr. Henry to process what was happening. His entire life, he had believed in the quiet power of doing his job without expecting anything in return. He had never sought attention. He had never wanted to be recognized or rewarded. But now, here he was, receiving more than he could ever have imagined. He shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. "But I don't understand. I didn't do anything special. I just did my job. I was there when you needed me, and that was enough for me. I didn't want anything more." Elon gave him a small, knowing smile. "You see, Mr. Henry, that's what makes it so special. You didn't do it for any reward. You did it because you cared. You cared enough to make the world a little bit better, no matter how small your role seemed. It's the little things, the moments when no one's watching, that make all the difference. And I think that's why you're struggling. You've never been in a position to receive, and now that you are, it's hard to believe you deserve it." Mr. Henry swallowed hard, his throat tight. The truth of Elon's words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He had never seen himself as worthy of anything more than his simple life. The idea that he might deserve something this grand, something so far beyond what he had known, was hard to wrap his mind around. "I never wanted anything more," he whispered, more to himself than to Elon. "I was just happy doing my job. I never thought anyone would see it, let alone thank me for it." Elon's voice was gentle but firm. "That's the thing. People like you, Mr. Henry, the ones who go unnoticed, who give without expecting anything in return, you deserve to be seen. You deserve to know that the world is a better place because of your actions." A silence settled between them. The air was thick with emotion, and for the first time, Mr. Henry felt like he was truly being seen. He had spent his whole life in the shadows, never asking for recognition, but now, he was realizing something profound. It wasn't about seeking validation or acknowledgement. It was about understanding that his worth wasn't defined by what he had done for others, but by who he was, by the heart that had always cared, always given, even when no one else noticed. "I've spent so much time hiding from recognition," Mr. Henry said quietly. "I didn't want to be noticed because I thought it would make me stand out, make me different from everyone else. But now, I feel like I've been given a second chance. Elon nodded, his eyes bright with empathy. This is your second chance, Mr. Henry. Not just at a new life, but at recognizing the value you've always had. It's time to let yourself be seen. It's time to let yourself be cared for. The weight of Elon's words hung in the air, and Mr. Henry felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. He wasn't just receiving a house or a staff, he was receiving the opportunity to live a life where he could embrace all that he had given to others, and allow himself to be cared for in return. As the conversation wound down and the evening sky deepened into dusk, Mr. Henry realized that he didn't need to change who he was. He didn't have to stop being the man who had always been content with the simple things. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could learn to accept that sometimes, the gift of giving also meant receiving. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The emotional weight that had been hanging over him seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt before. He still wasn't sure if he could ever completely get used to this new life, but for the first time, he understood that he didn't need to. He didn't need to be perfect, and he didn't need to have everything figured out. He just needed to take it one step at a time. And that was enough. For Mr. Henry, every day at the mansion felt like an intricate puzzle he was slowly piecing together. In the first few days, he had been overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of it all, the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, and the gardens that seemed to stretch on forever. It was all so far removed from the quiet, modest life he had led for so many years. But now, something was starting to change. As the days passed, he found himself growing more comfortable, not just with the mansion, but with the idea of being here. Elon had been a constant presence, always checking in on him, making sure that he was adjusting, and that he felt at home. It wasn't just the material things that made a difference. It was the way Elon had treated him, with a kindness and respect Mr. Henry had never known. He had been given a gift, yes, a lavish home, financial security, and opportunities he never dreamed possible, but it was the respect and friendship Elon had shown him that truly made him feel like a part of something bigger than himself. One afternoon, Mr. Henry sat by the poolside, staring at the shimmering water. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the patio. A cool breeze brushed past him, and for the first time since arriving, he felt a sense of calm. He had been wrestling with his inner conflicts, feeling unworthy of such luxury, unsure of his place in this new world, but sitting here, in this moment, he realized something profound. Maybe it wasn't about fitting into this world perfectly. Maybe it was about finding a way to bring the person he had always been into this new life. That was when Janet, the house manager, appeared beside him. She smiled warmly, her presence always so reassuring. "Mr. Henry, I was wondering if you'd like to join us for dinner tonight. Elon's invited you, and we're having a few guests over. It's a small gathering." Mr. Henry hesitated, but only for a moment. He wasn't used to being around so many people, especially those of such stature. But something about Janet's friendly demeanor made him feel comfortable. "I suppose I could join," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I could use the company." Janet's smile widened, and she nodded. "I'll let them know you'll be there. It's just a casual dinner, nothing too formal." As the evening approached, Mr. Henry found himself standing before the mirror in his room, unsure of what to wear. His old clothes, the ones he had worn while cleaning the hallways, seemed so out of place here. The elegant suits hanging in his closet were a reminder of just how far removed he was from everything he knew. He selected a simple navy blue shirt, a pair of khakis, and tried his best to make himself look presentable. He didn't want to stand out, but he also didn't want to look like he didn't belong. When he entered the dining room, Elon was already there, engaged in conversation with a few other guests. The table was set with crystal glasses, fine china, and candles that flickered softly in the dim light. It was beautiful, nothing like the small, modest dinners he had once shared with his family, but there was a certain warmth to the gathering that made him feel at ease. Mr. Henry. Elon greeted him with a broad smile, rising from his chair to offer a handshake. Glad you could make it. Please, take a seat. Mr. Henry felt the eyes of the other guests on him as he walked to the table, but Elon's warm greeting made him feel less like an outsider. He sat down beside Elon, and the conversation flowed easily. As the night progressed, he found himself relaxing, laughing at jokes, and even contributing a story or two about his years at the high school. It was as if he had rediscovered the ease of human connection, the kind he had always cherished but rarely experienced in such a grand setting. The dinner was a small, intimate affair, but for Mr. Henry, it was a milestone. It wasn't just about the food, the luxury, or the guests, it was about him realizing that he was a part of this world now. He was a man who had worked hard for his entire life and had now been given the opportunity to live differently, to live with dignity, and to be valued. And perhaps most importantly, he was beginning to see that it wasn't about how much money or prestige someone had. It was about the people, the connections, and the kindness that made life worth living. After dinner, Elon took him aside for a private conversation. The night air was cool, and the stars above sparkled brightly as they stood near the edge of the pool. Elon leaned against the stone railing, looking at Mr. Henry with a thoughtful expression. You know, I'm really proud of you, Elon said, his voice sincere. You've come a long way since you first arrived here. I can see you're starting to find your place. Mr. Henry shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the ground. It's still hard for me. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. I've spent my whole life doing things on my own, taking care of others, never asking for anything in return. It's hard to let go of that, to let people help me. Elon's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Mr. Henry's shoulder. It's not about letting go of who you are. It's about allowing yourself to be a part of something greater, to be a part of the future, and to know that you deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor. You don't have to do it alone anymore. That's what I want for you, to find joy in what you've been given. Mr. Henry stood still for a moment, taking in Elon's words. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about allowing himself to be seen for who he was, to accept that his worth didn't come from his work alone. It came from his kindness, his integrity, and his willingness to give. And now, it was his turn to receive. I think I'm starting to understand, Mr. Henry said quietly. Maybe I've been too afraid to embrace the change. But I'm beginning to see that I don't have to be someone else to fit in. I can still be me. Elon smiled, his eyes filled with pride. Exactly. And I'm here to support you in that journey, every step of the way. As they stood there, in the cool night air, Mr. Henry realized that he wasn't just being handed a new life. He was being given the space to grow, to embrace the future without losing sight of who he had always been. He had made it this far by working hard, by caring for others, and now it was time for him to care for himself, to allow others to care for him as well. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Henry felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't about the house, the wealth, or the fame. It was about the simple truth that, sometimes, the most powerful gift you can receive is the chance to live your truth, to be loved, supported, and cherished for who you truly are. The days continued to pass, and for Mr. Henry, life in the mansion started to feel less like an overwhelming dream and more like a second chance. Yet, no matter how much he tried to embrace his new reality, there were moments when the weight of everything, the house, the attention, the overwhelming sense of change, became too much. He had spent most of his life in the background, working tirelessly to keep things running, and suddenly, he was the center of attention in a way he wasn't sure how to handle. It was in those moments, when doubt crept in like a shadow, that he would find himself walking around the grounds, the expansive gardens and the towering trees offering a rare moment of solitude. As much as he appreciated the beauty around him, it often reminded him of how out of place he felt. He was no longer just the janitor, the quiet man who worked behind the scenes. Now, he was Mr. Henry, the man with a mansion, a fortune, and an uncertain future. One morning, as he strolled through the garden, lost in thought, Janet approached him with a gentle smile. "Mr. Henry, you look like you could use a little break. Would you like to join me for a walk? There's something I'd like to show you." Mr. Henry gave her a polite smile, grateful for the distraction. "I suppose I could use a little company," he replied, his voice softer than usual. They walked together in silence, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the gravel path the only sound between them. After a while, Janet spoke again, her tone casual but filled with sincerity. "You know, Mr. Henry, I've been working here for a few years now, and I've seen many people come and go. But you're different." Mr. Henry looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "Different how?" She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It's the way you carry yourself. You've been through so much in your life, and yet you still manage to stay humble, to stay grounded. It's something rare, especially in a place like this." The words caught him off guard. He had never thought of himself as particularly special. He had simply done what he believed was his duty: work hard, stay quiet, and take care of those around him. But Janet's words lingered in his mind, challenging him to see himself through a different lens. "I don't know about all that," Mr. Henry said with a small chuckle. "I've just always done what I've had to do. I never thought I was anything special." Janet smiled knowingly. "Maybe you didn't think so, but others see something in you. Sometimes, it takes someone else to point out what we can't see in ourselves." As they continued their walk, Mr. Henry felt a shift within himself. He had always been content with his simple life, and even now, in the midst of luxury and wealth, he didn't want to lose the essence of who he was. But Janet's words had planted a seed of doubt. Was he truly worthy of this new life? Did he deserve to be treated with such kindness, such reverence? As they reached a small bench by a fountain, Janet gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Henry, I want to show you something," she said, pulling out a small envelope from her bag. "This is for you." He looked at the envelope curiously before taking it from her hands. It was a simple envelope, but the weight of it felt significant. He opened it carefully, revealing a letter that seemed to be written by someone close to him. As he read through the letter, his eyes widened in surprise. The letter was from the school principal where he had worked for decades. It was filled with heartfelt gratitude for his years of service, his dedication, his quiet presence, and his unwavering support for the students and faculty. The principal spoke of the many lives Mr. Henry had touched over the years, the students he had helped, the teachers he had supported, and the countless hours he had spent ensuring the school ran smoothly. But what struck him the most was a single line at the end of the letter. "You may not have realized it, but you were the heart of our school, and you will always be remembered for the love and kindness you gave, without ever asking for anything in return." Mr. Henry felt a lump form in his throat as he finished reading. He had never expected this kind of recognition. He had never wanted it. But now, seeing the impact he had made on the people around him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of something more than just a life of quiet service. Janet watched him closely, giving him space to absorb the letter's contents. "I know this isn't easy for you, Mr. Henry. But sometimes, we don't see the full picture. And sometimes, we need to let others remind us of who we are." Mr. Henry sat there in silence, the weight of the letter heavy in his hands. For years, he had defined himself by his work, by what he did for others. But now, as he looked at the letter, he realized that his value wasn't just in his actions, it was in the way he made others feel. It was in the love, the care, and the kindness he had poured into every task, no matter how small. "I don't know what to do with all of this," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to help. But now, it feels like everything is changing." Janet's expression softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Change isn't easy. It's scary, even. But it's also a chance for growth. You don't have to figure it all out at once. Just take it one step at a time, and know that you're not alone. You've got people who care about you now. You deserve to take this chance. Mr. Henry nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to face it. He had spent so many years hiding behind the shadows of others, quietly doing his part. But now, he was learning to step into the light, not as someone who was looking for recognition, but as someone who finally realized his own worth. He stood up from the bench, the letter still in his hands, and looked around the garden. The sky above was painted with the colors of the setting sun, and for the first time, Mr. Henry felt at peace. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to figure out everything at once. But he was ready to embrace whatever came next, because for the first time in his life, he understood that he deserved it. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet reflections and gradual adjustments. Mr. Henry had come to appreciate his new life in the mansion, but there was still an underlying tension that remained, an unspoken question he often found himself grappling with. He had been given so much, more than he could have ever imagined, but how could he reconcile his past life with the luxuries that surrounded him now? And, perhaps more importantly, how could he bridge the gap between who he had been and who he was becoming? One afternoon, as he sat in the expansive living room, he found himself lost in thought. The house was unusually quiet, a rare moment of solitude that allowed his mind to wander. The tall windows framed a view of the rolling hills beyond, and for the first time, Mr. Henry allowed himself to fully appreciate the beauty of it all. But even as he marveled at the grandiose surroundings, there was a part of him that felt disconnected, a part that missed the simplicity of his old life, the quiet routine of his days at the school, the camaraderie with the other staff members. It was then that Elon appeared, quietly stepping into the room with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you?" Mr. Henry looked up, startled out of his reverie, but smiled in return. "Of course, Elon. I was just thinking, I guess." Elon sat down beside him, the casual ease with which he moved making Mr. Henry feel less out of place. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them watching the landscape outside. "I know you've been going through a lot of changes, Mr. Henry," Elon began, his tone thoughtful but not intrusive. "And I wanted to ask you how you're feeling about it all. About this new life. About everything." Mr. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of how to articulate the complexity of his feelings. "It's strange, Elon. There are moments when I feel like I don't belong here, like I'm not meant to be in a place like this. But then there are other moments, like when I'm sitting here, looking out at this view, and I realize that I've been given a chance to do something different, something bigger." Elon nodded, his eyes understanding. "I get it. It's not easy. Sometimes, the greatest gifts come with the heaviest burdens, and the more we receive, the more we question whether we deserve it." Mr. Henry stared at his hands, the rough palms that had spent years gripping cleaning tools and doing hard labor. He had never thought much about what he deserved. It had always been about doing what was needed, doing his part. He had been content with the simple life, with the sense of purpose that came from serving others. But now, sitting here in a mansion with no real responsibilities beyond his own well-being, he struggled to find the same sense of purpose. "I don't know how to change all of this," he admitted softly. "I don't know how to step into this new life without losing the parts of me that have always mattered." Elon leaned forward, his gaze focused on Mr. Henry. "You don't have to lose anything, Mr. Henry. What makes you who you are is already within you. The love, the work ethic, the kindness. That's not going to change just because of where you live or what you have now. It's part of who you've always been. And you deserve to live your life fully, without guilt or fear." Mr. Henry took in Elon's words, feeling a sense of relief. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off his chest. He hadn't been sure if he could reconcile the man he had always been with the man he was becoming. But Elon's words offered him a sense of hope, a chance to embrace who he was, without shame or doubt. But what about everyone else? Mr. Henry asked, his voice tinged with concern. What about the people I used to work with? The friends I left behind? Elon's eyes softened, his smile gentle. You haven't left them behind, Mr. Henry. You're still the same person. You're just living a different chapter of your story now. And that's okay. It's okay to change, to grow. What matters is that you stay true to yourself. The people who matter will understand that. The conversation lingered in the air between them, unspoken thoughts hanging like a quiet understanding. Mr. Henry had spent so much of his life defining himself by his work, by the people he cared for, and by the responsibilities he carried. But now, as he looked out at the horizon, he realized that he didn't need to be bound by those things anymore. He could still care, still work hard, still be humble. But he didn't have to carry the weight of the past with him. He could embrace this new life, this new opportunity, without losing who he was. That evening, as Mr. Henry sat at dinner with Elon and a few close friends, he felt a warmth in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't just the guest of honor because of his past service or the surprise gift that had transformed his life. He was simply there, a part of something greater, accepted and valued for who he was. The conversation at the table was light-hearted, filled with laughter and the easy camaraderie that came from shared experiences. As he listened to Elon tell a funny story about a recent project, Mr. Henry realized something important: the people in this world, whether they were billionaires or everyday people, weren't so different after all. They all had their struggles, their doubts, their moments of fear and uncertainty. And what truly mattered wasn't wealth or status, it was connection, friendship, and kindness. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Elon walked Mr. Henry to the door. You know, Elon said with a smile, I'm really glad you're here, Mr. Henry. You bring something to this house that money can't buy. Mr. Henry's heart swelled with gratitude. Thank you, Elon. I think I'm starting to understand what you mean. It's not about the house, the money, or the things. It's about the people. Elon nodded, his eyes warm with affection. Exactly. It's always been about the people. As Mr. Henry stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. The mansion, the wealth, the luxuries, they didn't define him. What defined him was his heart, his capacity to love and care for others. And that, he realized, was enough. The days that followed were a mix of old routines and new experiences. Mr. Henry found himself gradually adapting to his new lifestyle, but there were still moments when the reality of his situation overwhelmed him. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling above him, the weight of his past life pressing heavily on his chest. The mansion was magnificent, its marble floors and intricate chandeliers a far cry from the simple corridors of his old school. Yet, no matter how grand it seemed, it still didn't feel entirely like home. Home, for him, had always been a place of quiet and simplicity. Here, in the midst of opulence, he often felt like an outsider. One particularly difficult evening, he found himself wandering the halls of the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He hadn't intended to stay out this late, but something inside him drove him to keep moving. The walls, lined with family portraits and intricate sculptures, seemed to close in on him, the grandeur making him feel even smaller. Mr. Henry? Are you all right? A soft voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Janet standing in the doorway of the library, concern etched on her face. She had been a steady presence since the moment he arrived, gentle, understanding, and always there when he needed someone to talk to. I'm fine, Janet, Mr. Henry replied, offering a small smile. Just needed a little fresh air, I guess. Janet didn't look convinced. You've been up for hours. I'm sure you've got a lot on your mind. I know it's a lot to take in, but don't forget that you don't have to do this alone. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter than before. I don't know if I belong here, Janet. All of this, it's it's more than I ever expected. Sometimes I wonder if I'm even worthy of it. Janet stepped closer, her eyes softening. You are worthy, Mr. Henry. More than anyone I know. You've spent your entire life giving to others. You've been the quiet strength behind so many people's success, and now you have the chance to live for yourself. You deserve this. Her words were kind, but they didn't seem to reach the doubts gnawing at him. The idea of deserving wealth and recognition felt foreign, like trying to wear a coat that didn't fit. The reality of his new life seemed surreal, and at times, it was difficult for him to shake the feeling that he was playing a part in someone else's dream. Thank you, Janet, he said, his voice tight. But sometimes, I just feel like a ghost in all this. Like I don't really belong here. Janet studied him for a moment before giving him a warm smile. Sometimes, we don't realize how much we've earned until we stop to reflect. You've earned every bit of this, Mr. Henry. Don't let the size of this house or the wealth around you make you forget who you are. Mr. Henry nodded, though the weight of her words seemed to hang heavy in his heart. He couldn't deny the kindness Janet showed him, nor the gentle encouragement that Elon had extended in the past. But the question still lingered, how could he step into a life that felt so different from the one he had always known? Could he reconcile the man who had spent decades cleaning classrooms and fixing broken doors with the man who now lived in a mansion with the world at his feet? It was a question he hadn't yet found an answer to. The next morning, after a restless night, Mr. Henry made his way to the garden. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow across the dew-covered grass. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what he needed. He had always found solace in nature, in the simple beauty of a quiet morning. As he walked along the winding path, deep in thought, he was suddenly interrupted by a voice calling his name. Mr. Henry. He turned to see Elon approaching, his hands in his pockets and a relaxed smile on his face. I've been looking for you, Elon said, his tone casual yet sincere. I thought we could grab a cup of coffee and talk. Mr. Henry hesitated, then nodded. That sounds nice, Elon. They found a quiet bench near a small pond, the gentle ripples in the water mirroring the unease in Mr. Henry's chest. Elon poured them each a cup of coffee, and for a few moments, they simply sat in silence, listening to the sounds of nature around them. Finally, Elon spoke. I know things haven't been easy, Mr. Henry. I can see it in your eyes. You've always been the type of person who works hard and does what's necessary. You've spent a lifetime being the one who takes care of everything else, and now that it's your turn, it's hard to figure out what to do with yourself. Mr. Henry sighed, looking down at his coffee cup. You're right. I've spent my whole life taking care of other people, and now that I don't have to anymore, I feel lost. I don't know how to live in a place like this, or even if I'm meant to. Elon set his cup down and looked at Mr. Henry intently. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You're not expected to know exactly what to do or where to go. Life isn't about having all the answers at once, it's about finding your way, step by step. And right now, you're in a unique position, one that most people can't even imagine. But that doesn't mean you have to let it overwhelm you. Mr. Henry met Elon's gaze, feeling the sincerity in his words. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't a burden. Maybe this was an opportunity, not just to enjoy the life he had been given, but to embrace the freedom that came with it. I've never had the luxury of freedom, Mr. Henry said softly. It's always been about duty, about doing what needed to be done. Elon smiled knowingly. And that's why you're here. Because you did what needed to be done, without asking for anything in return. Now it's your turn to experience something different. Take it one day at a time, Mr. Henry. It doesn't have to be perfect. Mr. Henry sat back, the weight on his chest beginning to lighten. He didn't have to have everything figured out. It was okay to take things slow, to embrace the unknown. Life, he realized, wasn't about being perfect. It was about learning, growing, and allowing yourself the space to become who you were meant to be. The sun was higher in the sky now, the warmth spreading across the garden. Mr. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the first real sense of peace he had felt in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the way forward. And for the first time, it didn't seem so daunting. It had been a few weeks since Elon's conversation with Mr. Henry in the garden, and things were slowly beginning to fall into place. Yet, despite the calm that had settled over him, there was still a gnawing feeling deep inside, a sense that something was missing. Mr. Henry's transition into his new life had been smoother than he'd expected, but there was a lingering sense of disconnect that he couldn't shake. No amount of luxury or leisure could replace the deep connections he had once shared with people from his past. He missed the camaraderie of his co-workers, the smiles of the students he'd cleaned up after, and the quiet understanding of those who had known him for years. One particular morning, as he was enjoying a quiet breakfast on the terrace, Mr. Henry found himself scrolling through his old phone, looking through the contacts that had sat unused for months. As his finger hovered over the name of one of his former colleagues, Linda, he felt a pang in his chest. Linda had been a close friend for many years, a fellow janitor at the school who had shared countless late-night shifts and whispered conversations over coffee. He had lost touch with her when his life had changed, and the guilt from that loss weighed on him now. But reaching out felt difficult. What would he say? How could he explain his new life without sounding distant? Or worse, ungrateful? He hesitated for a moment longer, then, with a deep breath, pressed call. It rang several times before Linda answered, her voice sounding more surprised than anything else. "Mr. Henry? Is that you?" The familiar tone of her voice brought an immediate sense of comfort. "Hey, Linda. It's me. I've been meaning to reach out, but you know how it is, things have been a little crazy." Linda chuckled on the other end. "I can only imagine. You always kept things pretty quiet, so I'm guessing whatever's been going on has been pretty big for you." Mr. Henry smiled at her understanding. "Yeah, it's been a change, to say the least." He paused, unsure of how to continue. Linda, however, seemed to sense the hesitation in his voice. "Listen, Mr. Henry," she said gently. "If you need to talk, I'm here. You don't have to explain everything right away. I know we didn't exactly keep in touch after you left, but you were always a good friend. You can always count on me." The sincerity in her words was like a balm to Mr. Henry's soul. In that moment, he realized just how much he had missed these kinds of genuine connections, the kind that didn't require explaining or justifying one's life choices. "I've been thinking about that a lot," Mr. Henry admitted. "About how everything changed so suddenly. It's been overwhelming. But I don't want to lose touch with the people who mattered to me. You've been a big part of my life, Linda, and I don't want that to change just because of what's happened." There was a brief silence on the other end, then Linda's voice softened. "You don't have to worry about that, Mr. Henry. Life changes. It always does. But that doesn't mean you have to forget the people who were with you along the way. You're still the same person to me." Mr. Henry felt his eyes welling up at her words. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear them until now. The feeling of being seen, of being understood, was something that had been missing from his new life. "I'm sorry I've been distant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know how to balance everything, and I didn't want to seem different." "You're still you, Mr. Henry," Linda reassured him. "And if anything, it sounds like you're doing exactly what you need to do, taking care of yourself. It's okay to embrace the changes. And it's okay to reach out when you need someone to talk to." He smiled, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "Thank you, Linda. I've really missed you. I've missed you too. And hey, if you're ever up for a visit, I'm still at the school. We can grab coffee and catch up, just like old times." Mr. Henry felt a surge of gratitude. It had taken him weeks to build the courage to make this call, but it was the right decision. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the simplicity of old friendships. It wasn't about wealth or status, it was about shared history, trust, and the moments of laughter that made life worth living. "I'd love that," he replied. "I'll let you know when I'm in town next." They said their goodbyes, and as Mr. Henry hung up the phone, a sense of calm washed over him. The connections from his past weren't gone. They were still there, waiting to be rekindled, ready to remind him of who he was before the mansion, before the wealth, before the new world he had stepped into. That afternoon, he made a decision. He would take time to visit the school again, not as the janitor who had once worked there, but as a man reconnecting with the roots of his life. He would embrace his past while continuing to step forward into this new life. And he would do so without guilt, without shame, because both parts of his life were equally important. As he prepared for his visit, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The balance he had been searching for was beginning to take shape. The world wasn't so black and white. He could have both the life he had worked so hard for and the life that had shaped him. And perhaps, with each step, he would find a little more clarity. Later that evening, as he sat in the dining room with Elon, he couldn't help but share his thoughts. "I reached out to Linda today," he said quietly, his eyes thoughtful. "It felt good to reconnect." Elon's eyes lit up with approval. "That's great, Mr. Henry. I'm really glad to hear that. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the gift of remembering who we are, our roots, our people." Mr. Henry nodded, feeling a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I think I'm starting to understand that. It's not about leaving behind who I was. It's about embracing both who I am and who I used to be." Elon smiled, raising his glass. "To finding balance in all things." Mr. Henry raised his glass in return, a genuine smile on his face. "To balance, and to the people who help us find it." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day of Mr. Henry's visit to the school arrived, and with it, a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't stepped foot in the building for months, and while he knew it had all changed, part of him still saw the school through the lens of his old life, the life of a janitor who had spent decades cleaning classrooms, fixing faucets, and making sure the building stayed in working order. But today, it wasn't about the work. Today, it was about reconnecting with the people who had known him, truly known him, before the wealth and the mansion had altered everything. As he walked through the school's front doors, he couldn't help but be struck by how familiar it all felt. The hallway, with its worn linoleum floors, the sound of laughter echoing in the distance, and the unmistakable scent of old textbooks and chalk dust, everything was just as he remembered. It was as if time had stood still here, while his life had gone through unimaginable change. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before walking down the hallway. His footsteps were muffled by the soft carpet, but he could still hear the distant sounds of students in the classrooms. His eyes lingered on the bulletin board near the entrance, where pictures of the school's achievements hung proudly. It all seemed like a world away from the luxury he now inhabited, but he couldn't deny that this place had been his foundation. As he rounded the corner near the janitor's closet, the one where he had spent countless hours organizing cleaning supplies and fixing broken tools, he saw a familiar face. It was Linda. She was standing in the hallway, a welcoming smile on her face as she waved at him. "Mr. Henry." Linda called out, her voice warm and genuine. "It's so good to see you. You look great." Mr. Henry smiled, a wave of nostalgia rushing over him. "It's good to see you too, Linda. It feels strange to be back here." "I bet," she said with a chuckle. "Everything's still the same, right? Some things never change." He nodded, though he could tell that everything had changed in subtle ways. The faces of the staff and students were different, the energy of the school seemed younger and more vibrant, and the place itself felt somehow both the same and completely foreign at the same time. Linda stepped closer, her eyes bright with curiosity. "So, tell me. How have you been? I've been hearing a lot of things, everyone's curious, but no one knows exactly what happened. All we knew was that one day, you were gone, and the next, they said you were living the high life. You never told us much, and well, we just wanted to make sure you're doing okay." Mr. Henry chuckled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude for her concern. "I suppose I've been, trying to find my way," he said, feeling the weight of his new life settle in his chest once again. "It's been a big change, you know. Going from here to, well, to what it is now. But I'm figuring it out. Just taking things one step at a time." Linda studied him closely for a moment before her expression softened. "I can see it in your eyes, Mr. Henry. I know this whole thing must be overwhelming for you, but I want you to know that it's okay to feel that way. You've worked hard your whole life, and you deserve everything that's come your way. But don't forget, you're still the same person who helped fix leaky sinks and cleaned up after everyone else. That person doesn't disappear just because you've got a fancy address now." Her words were a balm to the uncertainty that had been gnawing at him. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that he was still the same person, even as everything around him had changed. "Thank you, Linda," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've missed these conversations. I didn't realize how much I needed them until now." Linda smiled, her expression kind. "I've missed you too, Mr. Henry. I'm just glad you're here today. It's good to see you back where you belong." The two of them continued to talk for a while, reminiscing about the old days, about the students who had passed through the school, the challenges they had faced, and the quiet camaraderie that had existed among the staff. Mr. Henry felt a warmth in his heart that had been missing for so long. It wasn't about the wealth, the fame, or the mansion, it was about the people, the connections, and the simple act of being present in each other's lives. As they walked together through the school, Linda showed him around, pointing out some of the changes that had been made to the building since he left. New classrooms had been added, some old fixtures had been upgraded, and there were plans for further renovations. Mr. Henry could see the evolution of the school, but it still carried the same spirit, the same sense of community and growth that had been there when he was part of it. At one point, they stopped outside the faculty lounge, where Mr. Henry had spent many quiet moments drinking coffee and catching up with the other staff members. "Remember this place?" Linda asked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "We used to sit in here during the breaks, gossiping about the students and trying to stay awake after the late-night shifts." Mr. Henry laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that felt like it had been too long in coming. "I do remember. It was those quiet moments that kept me going, especially when it felt like the days would never end." Linda's expression softened, and she gave him a knowing smile. "You know, Mr. Henry, it's those quiet moments that matter the most. The ones that nobody notices but make everything worth it. You may have left this place, but those moments, they stay with you. They stay with all of us." For the first time in a while, Mr. Henry realized that she was right. His past, his work, his quiet contributions, they mattered. They had shaped who he was, and they had created bonds that couldn't be broken by distance or time. As he said his goodbyes to Linda and walked out of the school, a sense of peace settled over him. He had returned to the familiar, to the people and places that had formed him. And for the first time, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the wealth he now had, but for the life he had lived and the people who had been there along the way. Back at the mansion that evening, Elon greeted him with a knowing smile. "Everything okay?" Elon asked, his tone gentle. Mr. Henry smiled, his heart full. "Yeah, Elon. Everything's more than okay. I think I've finally found a bit of balance." Elon raised his glass in a silent toast. Mr. Henry mirrored the gesture, grateful for the life he had now, but more so for the life that had brought him to this moment. The following weeks were filled with a quiet reflection for Mr. Henry. His visit to the school had been a reminder of everything he had left behind, of the small, meaningful moments that had defined his years of hard work. Yet, as much as he cherished those memories, something within him had shifted. It was as if the time spent in the company of those who had known him before his rise to wealth had reignited a deeper calling. He had been given so much in his life, but he felt an undeniable pull to give something back, something that carried more substance than just financial support. Elon had been a pillar of support throughout Mr. Henry's transition, and their bond had only grown stronger. Elon understood the depth of Mr. Henry's reflections, and his quiet encouragement helped guide him through moments of doubt. One evening, as the golden hues of the setting sun filtered through the large windows of the mansion, Mr. Henry found himself in a deep conversation with Elon. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Mr. Henry began, his voice thoughtful, "about what it really means to give back. I've had all this wealth, but something's missing. It's not enough to just live in this mansion, to be surrounded by luxury. I feel like I'm meant to do something more, something that impacts lives, not just mine." Elon looked up from his laptop, his eyes steady as he listened. "I can tell you've been struggling with this, Mr. Henry. The thing about giving back is that it's not just about writing checks or making big donations. It's about finding a cause that resonates with you, something that aligns with your values, your past, and your own journey." Mr. Henry nodded, the weight of Elon's words sinking in. He had lived his entire life with purpose, though it had been a different kind of purpose when he was a janitor at the school. Back then, his purpose had been simple: show up, do his best, help others. But now, things were far more complicated. He wanted his actions to speak louder than just his generosity. The next morning, he called Linda. Their conversation from the day before had been lingering in his mind. Linda, with her years of wisdom and no-nonsense perspective, had always been a voice of reason. "Linda, I've been thinking," Mr. Henry said, after exchanging pleasantries. "You're right about what you said before. It's those small, quiet moments that matter. And it's those small moments I want to give back to. But I'm not sure where to start. Can you help me figure that out?" Linda's voice was gentle but firm. "Of course I can, Mr. Henry. You've always had a heart for people. You don't need to make any grand gestures. It's the little things, things that can change lives, that matter the most. Why don't you start with the school? We could use some help in ways that go beyond money. We need mentorship, guidance, support for the students who might not have access to the resources they need." The idea was simple yet profound. The school had always been a place where Mr. Henry had found meaning in his work. Now, it seemed that the next chapter of his life could involve helping the students directly. He could give back not just by making donations but by becoming a mentor, an advocate, someone who showed up and inspired the students to believe in themselves, just as he had once believed in the students he cleaned up after. "I'd love to help out with the students," he said, his voice filled with newfound determination. "It's what I know best. I'll start by talking to the principal and see how I can get involved." Linda was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "I think that's a great idea, Mr. Henry. You have so much wisdom to offer. And the students will appreciate it more than you know." That afternoon, Mr. Henry reached out to the school's principal, Mr. Blake, a young and enthusiastic educator who had recently taken over the leadership role. He had known Mr. Blake when he was a teacher at the school, and although they hadn't worked closely together, there was a mutual respect between them. Mr. Blake answered the phone promptly. "Mr. Henry, what a pleasant surprise. How are you?" "I'm doing well, thank you," Mr. Henry replied. "I've been thinking a lot about the school recently, and I wanted to reach out. I'd like to offer my help. Not in the traditional sense, but more hands-on, if you will. I'd love to work with some of the students, help guide them through some of the challenges they face. I know it's a different approach, but it's something I believe I'm meant to do." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, then Mr. Blake's voice, filled with enthusiasm, responded. "That sounds incredible, Mr. Henry. We've always had a need for mentors, people who can give students the guidance and encouragement they need to succeed. I'm sure the students would benefit immensely from your experience. Mr. Henry smiled, the excitement of the possibility flooding through him. I'm happy to help however I can. I think it's time I gave back in a way that feels meaningful. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Blake said. Let's set up a time to meet and discuss the details. I'm sure we can find the perfect fit for you. The meeting with Mr. Blake was set for the following week, and Mr. Henry felt a renewed sense of purpose as he prepared for the next phase of his journey. He had spent so much time focused on himself, on adjusting to the changes in his life, but now it was time to focus on others. As the days passed, Mr. Henry continued to immerse himself in the planning for his mentorship program. He reached out to local organizations that supported underprivileged students, hoping to partner with them in providing additional resources. His connections and his status in the community opened doors, but he was determined that this wouldn't just be about throwing money at the problem. It would be about showing up, being present, and offering the type of guidance that only someone who had lived through adversity could offer. When he arrived at the school for his first meeting with Mr. Blake, his heart raced with anticipation. It was one thing to have an idea, it was another to turn it into action. But as he entered the principal's office, he could see that this was the beginning of something truly meaningful. Mr. Henry, I'm so glad you could make it, Mr. Blake said with a warm smile. I've been thinking a lot about how we can integrate you into the school community. We have a lot of students who could really benefit from having a mentor like you. Mr. Henry smiled, his chest swelling with pride. I'm ready to get started. Let's see how we can make a real impact. Together, they spent the next hour discussing the details of the mentorship program, working out the logistics of how Mr. Henry could best reach the students. And with that, a new chapter in Mr. Henry's life began, one filled with purpose, compassion, and a deep commitment to changing lives, just as his own life had been changed. Mr. Henry felt a surge of excitement as the first day of his mentorship program approached. It had been several weeks since his conversation with Mr. Blake, and all the pieces were finally coming together. The students were excited, and Mr. Henry could feel that this wasn't just going to be another volunteer job. This was a chance to make a real difference. The first session took place in the school's old library. The room, with its high ceilings and walls lined with shelves of worn but cherished books, felt like the perfect place to begin. The students he would be working with had been carefully selected by the school's counselors, students who had faced difficult circumstances, either at home or in their communities, but had shown promise and resilience. These were the young people who needed a mentor the most, and Mr. Henry was eager to step into that role. On the morning of the first session, Mr. Henry arrived early to set up. He brought a stack of notebooks, pens, and a few copies of his favorite books, ones that had inspired him throughout his life. He wasn't sure if the students would be interested in them, but he figured it was worth a shot. As he set up the room, he noticed the familiar hum of the school. Students hurried by in the hallway, their laughter echoing through the air. It was a rhythm he knew well, one that brought back memories of his own time in those very halls. He paused for a moment, taking it all in, before turning back to his task. Just as he was arranging the last of the chairs, the door creaked open, and a group of students filed in. They were a mix of ages, some as young as 14, others in their late teens. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and caution, unsure of what to expect from the man who had once been just another fixture in their school. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Henry greeted them with a warm smile, trying to set a comfortable tone. "My name is Mr. Henry, and I'm here to help however I can. We're going to spend some time talking today, not just about school, but about life. I want to get to know each of you, and I hope you'll get to know me a little bit, too." There was a moment of silence before a tall, quiet boy in the back raised his hand. "Are you like a counselor or something?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Mr. Henry chuckled softly. "Not exactly. I'm here to be more of a guide, someone to help you navigate the tough stuff, the things that maybe aren't always talked about in class. I've been around long enough to know that life isn't just about grades or tests. It's about learning to get through the hard times and finding a way to move forward. The students exchanged glances, and Mr. Henry could see the skepticism in their eyes. They weren't sure what to make of him yet, and that was okay. He knew it would take time to earn their trust. One by one, the students introduced themselves, sharing their names and a bit about their lives. Some were eager to speak, while others barely whispered their responses. Mr. Henry made sure to listen carefully, taking note of the little details they shared. It wasn't just about what they said, it was about the way they said it. He could hear the pain in some of their voices, the fear in others, and the quiet hope in a few. These were the voices he had come to mentor, and he knew this was where he was meant to be. After the introductions, Mr. Henry led the group in a conversation about their dreams. I know it might sound like a silly question, but I want you to think about something for a moment. What do you want to be when you grow up? The room fell silent again. Most of the students had probably been asked this question countless times, but the weight of it seemed different in this context. This wasn't a classroom full of teachers expecting a specific answer. This was a space for them to speak their truth, to share their real hopes and fears. The quiet boy from the back raised his hand again, and Mr. Henry nodded in his direction. I want to be a mechanic, the boy said, his voice soft but steady. I've always liked working with my hands. But I don't know if that's even possible. I'm not good at school. I don't know if I'll even graduate. Mr. Henry leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You know, I wasn't the best student either. But I can tell you this, if you love something, you can make it happen. It's not about being perfect at everything, it's about focusing on what you're passionate about and finding a way to make it work. You don't have to follow anyone else's path. The boy looked at him with a mixture of surprise and hope, as if hearing those words for the first time. Another student, a girl with short, curly hair, spoke up. I want to be a doctor. But I'm not sure I'll get there. My mom can't afford the classes I need, and sometimes I feel like I'm just wasting my time trying. Mr. Henry nodded sympathetically. I hear you. It's hard when life feels like it's in the way of your dreams. But here's the thing, no one can stop you if you're determined. I started working at the school as a janitor, and I never thought I'd be where I am today. I didn't have money, I didn't have connections, I had to work for it. But it's the work that matters, the perseverance, and the belief in yourself that will take you where you need to go. The girl's eyes lit up, and she nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Maybe I can do it. For the next hour, the group talked about their goals and fears. Some were more vocal than others, but Mr. Henry made sure to include everyone, encouraging them to open up. It wasn't about giving them all the answers, it was about helping them find their own voices. As the session came to a close, Mr. Henry felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. These students, who had started out skeptical and unsure, had begun to open up, to share their dreams and the barriers they felt standing in their way. And Mr. Henry realized that, just as much as they needed guidance, he needed them as well. This program was a two-way street, and in helping them, he was rediscovering parts of himself he thought he had lost. As the students filtered out of the room, Mr. Henry watched them go with a smile. It wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The next session would be different. It would build on what they had started, but it would also go deeper. They had only scratched the surface, but already, he could see that this mentorship would be the most important work of his life. The weeks that followed were transformative for both Mr. Henry and his group of students. What had started as a tentative step into the world of mentorship had quickly evolved into something far deeper. The students, once skeptical of the old janitor-turned-mentor, were beginning to open up. It wasn't just about the lessons Mr. Henry had hoped to teach them, it was about the lessons they had unknowingly started to teach him in return. Every session grew more intense, more personal. The students' stories started to surface like carefully guarded secrets. One by one, they shared their struggles, broken homes, absent fathers, unrelenting pressure to succeed, and in some cases, the looming fear of not making it out of their circumstances alive. These weren't just kids, these were survivors. And Mr. Henry began to see his own journey reflected in their lives. It wasn't lost on him that these young people had more in common with his younger self than he could have ever imagined. They were just like him, fighting against the odds, pushing through the daily grind, trying to make something of themselves. It was during one particular session that Mr. Henry truly realized the depth of the bond that had been forming. They had gathered in the same library, but today the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of camaraderie in the room, a quiet solidarity that hadn't been there before. He had asked the group to talk about something they had always wanted to change about their lives. The answers were raw, stripped of the pretenses that many of them had carried before. When it was the quiet boy's turn, the one who had dreamt of becoming a mechanic, he took a deep breath and spoke up. "I always wanted to fix cars, but I don't know how to get started. My mom doesn't have the money to send me to school for it, and my friends always tell me I'm wasting my time. They say I should just stick to something normal, like getting a job at the fast food joint down the street. But I know I'm capable of more. I just don't know how to prove it." Mr. Henry sat forward in his chair, his heart going out to the boy. He remembered those same feelings, the weight of doubt, the belief that dreams were only for the lucky. "I get it," Mr. Henry said quietly. "I've been there, too. But you know what? Dreams don't come with instructions, and sometimes they don't need to. The only thing that matters is that you don't stop trying, even when it feels impossible." The boy's eyes met his, and for the first time, Mr. Henry saw a flicker of hope in them. It was the kind of hope that had been buried for so long under layers of self-doubt and fear. But now, it was beginning to surface. A girl in the back, who had initially been very reserved, finally spoke up. "I used to think I wasn't smart enough to be a doctor. But lately, I've been thinking, what if I'm not supposed to do things the way everyone else does? What if my path is just different?" Mr. Henry smiled. "That's exactly right. Your path doesn't have to look like anyone else's. The world's full of doctors who followed the typical route, and they're great. But maybe you're the kind of doctor who will come up with a new way of doing things. Maybe you'll find a way to help people no one else has even thought of. That's the beauty of making your own way." The other students nodded, their expressions softening, as though they were finally allowing themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could achieve what they had longed for. As the session wrapped up, Mr. Henry found himself feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment. He hadn't just listened to them, he had guided them, shown them that their dreams were worth fighting for. More than that, though, he had given them something even more valuable, the belief that they were capable of more than they ever thought possible. That night, as he sat in his office, Mr. Henry found himself reflecting on how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had been sitting alone in his mansion, struggling to find a sense of purpose. Now, he was surrounded by young people who looked to him for guidance, who trusted him with their hopes and fears. He thought about the students, about their stories and the potential they held. He remembered how he had once been where they were, filled with doubt and uncertainty about his future. And now, here he was, not just a man of wealth, but a man of experience, someone who could offer guidance, someone who could make a difference in ways that money couldn't measure. As he sat there, his mind raced with ideas. There was so much more he could do. He could offer scholarships, internships, and even hands-on training. But most importantly, he could be a mentor to these kids in the truest sense of the word. He could show them that they weren't alone in their struggles, that someone believed in them. The next day, he made a call to the local community college and started inquiring about trade programs. He knew that the boy who wanted to be a mechanic could use a hands-on course to help him get started. He also spoke with a friend who worked in the medical field about internship opportunities for students like the girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. Each step he took, each phone call he made, brought him closer to the mission he had set for himself. As the weeks passed, Mr. Henry continued to guide the students, offering practical advice, helping them apply for scholarships, and connecting them with people in his network who could give them opportunities. But it wasn't just about the tangible resources, it was about showing them, with every word and every action, that they were worthy of success. The more he gave, the more he realized that this was the true gift he had been searching for. It wasn't the mansion, the car, or the wealth that filled the emptiness in his heart. It was the opportunity to change lives, to show others that they, too, could overcome the obstacles in their path. And in the process, he was changing his own life, too. The following month brought with it a series of challenges that none of them had expected. Despite the growing connection between Mr. Henry and his students, the road wasn't always smooth. The world outside the classroom was still full of obstacles, and it became clear that mentorship wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Some students, though excited at first, began to show signs of resistance. Others, who had seemed to open up in the beginning, withdrew into their shells, convinced that their circumstances were too far gone to change. It started with Jalen, the boy who had expressed an interest in becoming a mechanic. At first, Jalen had been enthusiastic, his eyes lighting up every time they spoke about his dream. But as the weeks wore on, his enthusiasm began to fade. He started missing sessions, showing up late, and when he did attend, he was quieter than usual. One day, after an entire week of absence, Jalen finally showed up. His eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes were wrinkled. Mr. Henry could tell something wasn't right. He watched as Jalen shuffled into the room and took a seat without saying a word. Mr. Henry approached him after the session, pulling him aside gently. "Jalen," he began, his voice soft but concerned, "I've noticed you've been having a tough time lately. Is everything okay?" Jalen avoided his gaze, staring down at his shoes. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice low. Mr. Henry wasn't convinced. He had been a janitor for years, and part of the job had been dealing with young people like Jalen, kids who had problems they didn't know how to express. So, he pressed a little more. "You know, Jalen, life's tough sometimes. It's okay if you're not okay. You don't have to go through it alone. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Jalen finally looked up, his face a mix of anger and frustration. "I don't need your help, Mr. Henry. I'm fine." But his tone was shaky, like he wasn't even convinced of the words he was saying. "Well," Mr. Henry replied, "if you need help, I'm here for you. And I want you to know I believe in you. But I can't help if you don't let me." Jalen shook his head, standing up abruptly. "I don't need anyone. I'll figure it out." Mr. Henry watched him walk away, his heart heavy with the weight of Jalen's silence. He had been so eager to help, but it seemed like Jalen wasn't ready to accept that help just yet. And that hurt. It reminded him of the times in his own life when he had refused help, thinking he could solve everything alone, only to realize later how wrong he had been. The next session, Mr. Henry was determined not to let Jalen slip away. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to find a way to break through. He decided to focus on building the group dynamic even more, trying to create a support network where everyone could lean on each other. As the students arrived, he noticed a few familiar faces: Ariana, who had dreams of becoming a doctor, and Marcus, who wanted to be an artist. Both had been consistent, showing up to every session, eager to contribute. But something was missing. The sense of camaraderie that had begun to form felt strained. The group was divided, some were eager to open up, while others, like Jalen, were pulling away. Mr. Henry tried to focus on the positive. "Today, I want us to do something a little different," he began, trying to stir the group into action. "We're going to start by talking about one thing we've learned about ourselves in the last few weeks. It can be big or small, but I want you to think about something that's changed in you since we began this journey together." There was a long pause. Some students glanced at one another, unsure of how to begin. Finally, Ariana spoke up. "I think the biggest thing I've learned is that I have to stop being afraid of failing. I've been so scared that I wouldn't make it through med school, that I wouldn't be good enough to be a doctor. But now, I see that failing isn't the end. It's just part of the journey. Mr. Henry smiled, proud of her vulnerability. That's powerful, Ariana. A lot of people never realize that. The fear of failure can hold you back, but it doesn't have to. Next, Marcus spoke up. I've realized that I don't have to wait for the perfect moment to start drawing. I used to think I needed to have everything figured out before I could create. But now, I know that I just need to start. That's the only way to get better. The group began to open up, sharing their thoughts and reflections, one after another. Even the quieter students, like Suri, who had wanted to be a writer, began to speak more openly. There was something about hearing their peers speak so honestly that made them feel safe enough to do the same. And then, as the conversation flowed, Mr. Henry turned to Jalen. He hadn't spoken yet, and Mr. Henry could sense the internal struggle within him. Jalen, I know this hasn't been easy for you, Mr. Henry said gently, his voice full of understanding. But you're part of this group, and I want to know what you've learned about yourself. Jalen shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers playing with the sleeve of his jacket. For a moment, Mr. Henry thought he might not say anything. But then, slowly, Jalen looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. I've learned that I don't know how to ask for help. I keep trying to do everything on my own, but it's just too hard. He paused, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and relief. I guess I've been scared of failing, and I didn't want anyone to see that. The words were a revelation, not just to the group, but to Jalen himself. He had just admitted something that had been buried deep inside of him for so long. It was the first step toward healing, toward accepting that it was okay to need help, that no one was expected to face the world alone. The room grew quiet, but there was a sense of solidarity in the air. Mr. Henry smiled softly, proud of how far they had all come. You're not alone, Jalen. None of you are. We're all in this together. The session ended on a hopeful note, the kind of note that made Mr. Henry believe in the power of the group, of the connections they were building. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. There would be setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt. But for the first time, he felt confident that these students, with his help and with each other's support, could overcome anything. Despite the breakthrough moments of shared vulnerability, the weeks that followed still weren't without their struggles. Mr. Henry had always prided himself on his ability to maintain a calm and collected exterior, but the weight of responsibility that now rested on his shoulders felt heavier than ever before. He wasn't just guiding students through their academic challenges anymore, he had become an emotional anchor for them. And while he was more than willing to shoulder that burden, the toll it was taking on him was starting to show. One day, as he walked into the library for another group session, he found his mind clouded with doubt. The successes were undeniable, Jalen was slowly returning to the group, Ariana's confidence was growing, and Marcus had started submitting sketches that reflected his growing passion for art. But there was something missing, a sense of fulfillment. He had poured so much of himself into helping these kids, but he wasn't sure if he was making the difference he had hoped to make. Mr. Henry? Ariana's voice broke through his thoughts. She was sitting at the table, her usual brightness dimmed by a furrowed brow. Yeah, Ariana. Is everything okay? He sat down across from her, noticing the concern in her eyes. I just don't feel like I'm moving forward, she admitted, pushing a few stray strands of hair behind her ear. I've been applying to so many colleges, but every rejection letter feels like a punch in the gut. It's like I'm doing everything I can, but it's just not enough. Mr. Henry's heart went out to her. He knew how tough it could be to fight for something you wanted so badly and still come up empty. I know it feels impossible right now, but let me tell you this, you're already doing the most important thing, you're not giving up. College acceptance letters are just pieces of paper. They don't define you. Ariana's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking. But it feels like that's all anyone cares about. The letter. The degree. If I don't get in, what's the point? The pain in her voice made Mr. Henry's chest tighten. It was a familiar feeling, the fear of being unseen, of feeling like your worth was tied to external validation. But he couldn't let her get lost in that. Not after all they'd been through. Ariana, listen to me. He leaned forward, his voice steady but full of emotion. I've seen the way you care about people. I've seen how hard you work, how much you believe in helping others. That's what matters. A degree doesn't make you who you are. It's your heart, your drive, your willingness to make the world better. That's your strength. She wiped her eyes and nodded, but the weight of the moment lingered. Mr. Henry could tell that her struggle was only just beginning. The world was harsh, and for someone like Ariana, so filled with potential, yet still uncertain of her place, it felt like the fight would never end. But there was nothing he could say that would take that pain away. So, he did the only thing he knew to do. He stayed. He listened. He offered her a hand to hold in those quiet moments of uncertainty. As the days passed, Mr. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a battle not only for his students, but for himself. His own insecurities, the feelings of inadequacy that had plagued him for years, started to surface again. Was he really making a difference? Was he equipped to guide these young people toward their dreams, especially when he still felt so lost in his own life? It wasn't until one afternoon, when Jalen came in early to one of their sessions, that Mr. Henry got the reminder he needed. "Hey, Mr. Henry," Jalen said quietly, his tone different than usual. He had been showing signs of progress, returning to the group regularly and engaging more openly. Still, there was a subtle sadness in his eyes. "Hey, Jalen. What's up?" Mr. Henry greeted, trying to keep the conversation light. "I was thinking about what you said that day, about not doing things alone," Jalen began, avoiding eye contact. I realized you were right. I can't keep pushing people away." The words hit Mr. Henry harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" Jalen looked up then, his expression sincere. "I've been so focused on trying to figure everything out on my own, thinking that if I ask for help, it'll make me weak. But I don't think that's true anymore. I don't have to be alone in this." Mr. Henry felt his heart swell. He knew how hard it had been for Jalen to admit this, how much it took to break down those walls. But hearing it, knowing he had played a part in it, gave him the encouragement he needed. "That's powerful, Jalen," Mr. Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm proud of you for realizing that. It's never easy to ask for help, but it's one of the strongest things you can do. You don't have to fight your battles by yourself." Jalen nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm ready to take the next step. I might not have it all figured out, but I'm willing to try. And I think that's enough." Mr. Henry couldn't help but smile back. "You're already ahead of a lot of people, Jalen. You're not giving up. That's the most important thing." That evening, as Mr. Henry sat in his office, he reflected on their conversation. It wasn't just Jalen who had made progress. Every one of his students, in their own way, had come so far. They had all faced moments of doubt, of feeling lost, but they were pushing forward. And somehow, despite his own doubts, he had been there for them, offering support when they needed it the most. The emotional weight of the job was still heavy, but for the first time in a while, Mr. Henry felt a flicker of hope. His students weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And that gave him the strength to keep going, even when the path ahead seemed unclear. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sense of accomplishment wash over him. The journey wasn't over, but it was already more meaningful than anything he had done in years. The weeks that followed were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. Mr. Henry felt the immense satisfaction of seeing his students slowly become more confident and determined. Yet, despite the progress, he couldn't help but feel the quiet ache of exhaustion creeping in. There was only so much of himself he could give before he started to feel drained. And in these moments, when the weight of others' hopes rested on him, the pressure began to gnaw at his confidence. The truth was, Mr. Henry had never really thought about the toll mentoring would take on him. He'd always been the person who showed up for others, whether it was to sweep the halls, fix a broken chair, or lend an ear. But this was different. This was personal. He wasn't just helping these kids with their homework or school projects anymore. He was helping them navigate their futures, their dreams, and their deepest fears. The emotional toll of the job was far greater than anything he'd experienced before. One evening, after a particularly draining session where Ariana had broken down in tears over yet another rejection letter and Jalen had come to him, again, questioning whether he was good enough to pursue his dream of becoming a mechanic, Mr. Henry sat alone in his small apartment. The fluorescent light buzzed above him, and he absently stared at the stack of papers on the table, notes for upcoming lessons, college brochures, scholarship information. The apartment felt unusually quiet tonight. The silence was deafening, and the loneliness seemed more pronounced in this moment. He reached for his phone, scrolling through messages from his former colleagues. They were congratulating him on the progress he had made with the students, but something about their words felt distant, detached. The truth was, no one really understood what it was like to take on the burden of so many young lives, to carry their dreams along with their disappointments. Mr. Henry exhaled deeply, his hand resting on the edge of the table. What if I'm not enough for them? What if I fail? The thought lingered in his mind, dark and persistent. The idea of failure had always haunted him, but it was different now. Before, it was his own life that felt uncertain. Now, he had a hand in shaping the futures of these kids, and the weight of their potential weighed heavily on his heart. He wasn't just their mentor, he was their lifeline. And the fear of not being enough, of falling short of their expectations, felt suffocating. He grabbed a notebook from the shelf and began to write. The act of writing had always been cathartic for him, but tonight, the words felt like a burden. Am I doing the right thing? Am I enough? He paused, the pen hovering over the page. Was he really equipped to guide these kids? Was he the right person for this job? He had spent so many years as the janitor, a silent observer to the lives of others, never expecting to become more. But now, he had transformed into someone who mattered. Someone who could help shape the direction of these young people's lives. The problem was, he didn't feel like he was doing enough. As he stared at the notebook, a knock at his door startled him. It was late, far too late for anyone to be visiting. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and made his way to the door. He opened it to find Marcus standing there, holding a sketchbook in his hands. The young artist's face was serious, his usual exuberance replaced by a rare expression of vulnerability. "Hey, Mr. Henry. Can we talk?" Mr. Henry smiled, though it was laced with exhaustion. "Of course, Marcus. Come on in." Marcus stepped inside, looking uncomfortable as he took a seat at the kitchen table. He fidgeted with the sketchbook, hesitant to speak. "What's on your mind, Marcus?" Mr. Henry asked, settling into the chair across from him. The artist looked down at his hands, then at the sketchbook he was clutching. "I wanted to show you something. I've been working on this for a while, but I didn't know if I was ready to share it." Mr. Henry raised an eyebrow, curious. "Well, you've got me all intrigued now." Marcus opened the sketchbook and flipped through several pages filled with vibrant drawings, some abstract, some realistic, all full of raw emotion. But it wasn't just the quality of the work that stood out. It was the way each drawing seemed to reflect something deeper, something Marcus hadn't said out loud. Finally, Marcus landed on a particular drawing. It was a detailed, almost haunting portrait of a young man, sitting alone, his face a mixture of sadness and determination. The lines of the drawing were sharp, the shading bold, giving it an intensity that made Mr. Henry's chest tighten. I wanted to capture how I've been feeling lately," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Like I'm stuck between two worlds. I know I want to be an artist, but sometimes it feels like I don't belong in either world. Like I'm not good enough, or I'm just wasting my time. Mr. Henry's heart broke at the raw honesty in Marcus' words. The fear of being unseen, of being misunderstood, he recognized it all too well. It was the same fear that had plagued him for years. But seeing it in Marcus' eyes made him realize something important. Marcus wasn't alone in his doubt. In that moment, Mr. Henry understood that it wasn't just him who carried the weight of uncertainty. His students, his kids, were all navigating their own fears and questions. Marcus, Mr. Henry began, his voice filled with warmth, this drawing is incredible. You've captured something real here. You're not wasting your time. You're pouring your heart into something that matters. Art matters. Your art matters. Marcus looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But what if it's not enough? What if no one ever sees it? That's not what matters, Mr. Henry replied, his voice steady with conviction. What matters is that you see it. That you create it. And if you believe in your work, then the right people will eventually see it too. You have a gift, Marcus. And don't ever let fear take that away from you. For the first time in weeks, Marcus smiled, his expression lightening as the tension seemed to melt away. Thanks, Mr. Henry. I needed to hear that. Mr. Henry smiled back, but the weight in his heart was still there. Despite his reassuring words, he couldn't shake the question that had been circling his mind, am I really the mentor they need? But in that moment, seeing Marcus' relief, he understood one thing clearly, even when the path forward was unclear, even when doubts crept in, he was still making a difference. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't have all the answers. But he was present. And sometimes, that was enough. The days felt like a blur for Mr. Henry. The weight of his students' expectations, his own lingering doubts, and the pressures of balancing his responsibilities had begun to take its toll. Each day he stepped into the library, he tried to put on a brave face. But there were moments when the exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. It was hard to ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind, what if I'm not doing enough? What if I'm failing them? But as much as the doubt clung to him, something else was growing, something even more powerful than the fear. It was the fire in his students' eyes, the hope that had begun to blossom in their hearts. And that, Mr. Henry realized, was why he couldn't give up. One afternoon, as he was sorting through papers at his desk, Ariana walked in with a strange expression on her face. Her usually bright demeanor was subdued, and her eyes avoided his gaze. He immediately knew something was wrong. Ariana, what's going on? Mr. Henry asked gently, noticing the heaviness in her tone. She hesitated before sitting down across from him. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Mr. Henry. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been waiting for a breakthrough moment with Ariana, and now she was questioning everything. What do you mean? You've been doing so well. I thought things were improving, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I just feel like I'm falling behind, she said, her voice wavering. Everyone around me is so far ahead. They know what they want to do, and they've got their lives figured out. But me? I'm just stuck. I don't even know if I want to go to college anymore. Her words made Mr. Henry's heart ache. He could feel the weight of her uncertainty. It was something he'd struggled with in his own life, the constant feeling of being lost, not knowing which direction to take. He understood how it could feel like the whole world was moving forward while you were standing still, unsure of your place. Ariana, he said softly, I understand. But you've got to trust that your journey is your own. It's okay to not have everything figured out right now. Sometimes, it's about taking one step at a time, even if the path isn't clear. But what if I don't even know what step to take, she asked, her voice trembling. Then you start by asking yourself what makes you feel alive. What is it that excites you, even when you're not sure where it'll lead? It's okay to not know the destination. It's the journey that shapes us. Ariana stared at him, and for a moment, it seemed like his words weren't reaching her. She was still lost in her own doubts. But then, something shifted in her expression. It was a flicker of hope, a small crack in the wall of uncertainty she had built around herself. I guess, maybe you're right. Maybe I need to start by figuring out what I really care about. Not what I'm supposed to care about, but what I truly want to do. Mr. Henry smiled, the familiar warmth returning to his chest. Exactly. And you're not alone in this. We're all figuring it out together, one step at a time. As Ariana left the library that day, her shoulders seemed a little lighter, her steps a little more purposeful. But Mr. Henry knew that the battle wasn't over. Ariana's doubts would return, just as his own had. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. He had been there for her in that moment of vulnerability, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to get her through. Later that evening, as Mr. Henry sat on his worn-out couch, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. Hey Mr. Henry, I just wanted to thank you again. I've been working on a new piece, and I feel like I'm finally getting closer to finding my voice as an artist. I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for your encouragement. I just wanted you to know that it means a lot. Mr. Henry read the message several times, his chest tightening with emotion. He felt the familiar weight of doubt creeping in, but for once, it was overshadowed by something else. Hope. The feeling that, despite everything, he was making a difference. Even on his toughest days, he was helping these kids find their way. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, being there for them, and letting them know that they were seen. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Jalen. Mr. Henry, I'm thinking of signing up for an apprenticeship at a local auto shop. It's a big step for me, but I feel ready. Thanks for always believing in me. The message filled him with pride. Jalen had been so uncertain about his future just a few months ago. Now, he was taking charge, making decisions for himself, and pushing forward. And then there was Ariana, struggling with her own doubts but still willing to take that first step toward self-discovery. Mr. Henry leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. There was still so much to be done, so many challenges to face. But in this moment, he allowed himself to feel proud. His students were becoming the people they were meant to be, slowly but surely. And in doing so, they were showing him something important, that even the smallest acts of encouragement, the quietest moments of support, could make a world of difference. But as the night wore on, another thought crept into his mind. What if I'm not here for them when they need me the most? What if I let them down? The question lingered, but Mr. Henry pushed it aside for now. He would face that challenge when it came. For now, he had to keep moving forward, just as his students were. They were on their own journeys, each of them stumbling, learning, and growing. And he would be there, every step of the way. It had been weeks since the last conversation with Marcus and Ariana. The library was quieter these days, a sign that the students had begun to take the next steps toward their futures. But even though there was a sense of progress, Mr. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was on the horizon. There was an uneasy calm before the storm, and the weight of that quietness was palpable in the air. One rainy afternoon, as he was cleaning up the last of the papers from a particularly heavy day of mentoring, the door to the library opened. The sound of footsteps on the wet concrete caught his attention before the figure stepped inside. It was someone he didn't expect, Elon Musk. Mr. Henry blinked in disbelief, not sure if his eyes were deceiving him. Elon Musk, the visionary, the billionaire who had reshaped industries, was standing in the doorway of the school library. Dressed in his usual casual attire, his presence seemed almost surreal. Elon. Mr. Henry stammered, his voice betraying his surprise. What are you doing here? Elon smiled, a warm but somewhat tired smile, as he stepped further into the room. I know it's a bit unexpected, but I wanted to meet you in person. I've been following your work with the students here, and I have to say, I'm impressed. Mr. Henry's mind raced. How did he find out about me? But before he could respond, Elon continued. You've done more than just give them academic support. You've given them hope, the kind that goes beyond grades and achievements. You've taught them to believe in themselves. And honestly, I think that's something the world needs more of. Mr. Henry could hardly believe what he was hearing. A man who had changed the world with his innovations was now praising his humble efforts as a school janitor. I'm not sure what to say, Mr. Henry replied, his voice filled with awe. I just wanted to help them, you know. Give them the chance I didn't have. That's exactly it, Elon said, his voice calm but firm. It's not about your past or where you came from. It's about what you're doing now. You've changed the trajectory of these kids' lives by showing them what's possible. And I want to help you do even more. Mr. Henry was taken aback. Help me? How? Elon paused for a moment, his eyes reflecting a mix of thoughtfulness and sincerity. I've been thinking about how many people like you don't get the recognition they deserve. People who quietly make a difference, who pour everything into the people they care about, without expecting anything in return. That's why I'm here today. I want to give you a gift that will allow you to do even more for these kids. At first, Mr. Henry was skeptical. I'm just a janitor, Elon. I'm not looking for recognition. I'm just doing my part. Elon smiled, shaking his head. Recognition is not the goal. The goal is impact. And I believe that the impact you've already made is just the beginning. Before Mr. Henry could say anything else, Elon pulled out a small, sleek envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it over. I've arranged a scholarship fund for you. It's not just for your students, but for you, to further your own education. I believe you have the potential to do even more, whether that's expanding your program, starting your own foundation, or simply continuing to mentor these kids in a more official capacity. You have something special, Mr. Henry. You have the ability to change lives, and I want to make sure you have every opportunity to do so. Mr. Henry stood frozen, staring at the envelope in his hand, his mind swirling with disbelief. A scholarship for me? It didn't make sense. He was just a janitor, a man who had spent his life cleaning up messes. What had he ever done to deserve such a gift? Mr. Henry started, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent years working quietly behind the scenes, never expecting anything in return. The thought of receiving such a generous gift felt overwhelming, almost as if he didn't deserve it. But Elon's words echoed in his mind. It's about impact. Elon reached forward, placing a hand on Mr. Henry's shoulder. You've already had an impact, and now, I want to make sure that impact grows. Whatever path you choose, I'll be here to support you. You're not just a janitor, Mr. Henry. You're a mentor. And mentors like you are the ones who shape the future. For the first time in what felt like ages, Mr. Henry allowed himself to feel something he rarely experienced, hope. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to process this, but I promise I won't waste it. I'll do everything I can to make sure it counts. Elon smiled warmly, his eyes reflecting a genuine admiration. I know you will. And remember, no matter how big or small the difference, every change starts with one person deciding to take action. You've already taken that step. Now, let's see how far it can go. As Elon left the library, his footsteps echoing down the hall, Mr. Henry sat down at the desk, still holding the envelope. The rain outside had started to let up, and the clouds parted just enough to let the first rays of the setting sun peek through. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, and for the first time in a long while, Mr. Henry felt a sense of clarity. This was his chance. This was his moment to make an even bigger difference. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer alone. He had the support he needed, and more importantly, he had the belief in himself that he had always lacked. The weeks following Elon Musk's visit were a whirlwind. Mr. Henry's life, once a quiet and routine existence in the school, had suddenly taken a dramatic turn. The scholarship fund Elon had set up was a game changer, not just for him, but for the students he had dedicated his life to. It was an opportunity he could hardly comprehend, but one he knew he had to make the most of. The first thing he did after the visit was gather all of his students in the library. The room, usually filled with the soft rustling of pages and the quiet hum of concentration, was now alive with curiosity and excitement. Mr. Henry could sense their energy, but there was also something else: hope. They had witnessed his transformation, his growth, and now they were ready to take their own first steps toward the future. "I know you've all been through a lot this year," Mr. Henry began, standing at the front of the room. His voice was steady, but inside, his heart was racing. "But today, I have something incredible to share with you. Something that's going to change everything." The students leaned forward, their eyes wide with anticipation. "Elon Musk, the man who changed the way we think about technology and the future, has given me something that could change not only my life, but also yours." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He's given me a scholarship fund, not just for me, but to support this program, to help you all reach your potential, and to give us the resources we need to make sure every single one of you can pursue your dreams." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Mr. Henry could see the questions in their eyes. Could this really be true? He smiled and nodded. "It's real. And it's because of everything you've done, everything you've achieved, and everything you are capable of. You've all shown me that the impossible is possible if we just believe in each other." Ariana, sitting near the front, raised her hand shyly. "But Mr. Henry, how are we supposed to use this? We're just getting started." Mr. Henry's heart swelled with pride as he looked at her. "That's exactly the point. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. The scholarship is there to support you as you discover your path, whether that means college, an apprenticeship, or starting your own project. It's about creating opportunities, and I'm here to help you every step of the way." For the first time in a long time, Ariana smiled. It was a soft, hesitant smile, but it was genuine. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into the library months ago, unsure of herself and full of doubt. She had taken a step forward, just as the others had. The room was filled with excitement, but amidst the joy, there was a quiet understanding, a recognition of the responsibility that came with this new opportunity. The scholarship was more than just money or resources. It was a symbol of trust, a promise that their futures were worth investing in. Over the next few months, Mr. Henry worked tirelessly to build the framework for the program. He collaborated with local organizations, schools, and businesses, creating pathways for his students to explore careers, education, and creative pursuits. He wasn't just a janitor anymore, he was a mentor, a guide, a bridge to a brighter future for every student who walked into his library. Marcus, who had struggled with his confidence for so long, had found his calling in the world of graphic design. With the help of the scholarship fund, he enrolled in a part-time design program at a nearby community college. His first piece of artwork, a vibrant, abstract painting inspired by the chaos and beauty of life, was displayed at a local gallery. He hadn't just discovered his passion, he was sharing it with the world. Jalen, who had once been on the verge of dropping out of school, had embraced his love for cars and mechanics. With the mentorship of a local auto shop owner, he began an apprenticeship that not only gave him hands-on experience but also a new sense of purpose. His hands, once stained with doubt, were now stained with grease as he worked on engines, crafting a future for himself with every turn of the wrench. And Ariana? She had found her voice, literally. After months of soul-searching, she discovered a passion for writing and storytelling. The scholarship allowed her to attend creative writing workshops and start working on her first novel. She was no longer the girl who questioned her worth, she was the girl who was going to change the world with her words. As for Mr. Henry, he had never felt more alive. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to inspire, and new moments of triumph. His students were no longer just young faces passing through his life, they were his legacy. He had given them the tools to believe in themselves, and in return, they were showing him what it meant to truly make a difference. One afternoon, as he stood in the library, watching his students work on their projects, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Ariana, Marcus, and Jalen standing behind him, their smiles wide and genuine. "Mr. Henry," Ariana said, her voice full of emotion, "we just wanted to say thank you. You've given us more than just knowledge. You've given us hope. And that's something we'll carry with us forever." Mr. Henry felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the three of them. They had come so far, each one a testament to the power of encouragement, belief, and the simple act of showing up for someone when they needed it most. "I'm just one part of your story," he said quietly. "You're the ones who've taken the steps, who've made the choices. I'm just proud to have been a part of it." As he watched them walk away, their heads held high, he realized something important: it wasn't about the gift. It wasn't about the scholarship, the money, or the recognition. It was about the transformation, the way their lives had changed because someone had believed in them. The future was no longer uncertain for these students. They were ready to face whatever came their way, and with Mr. Henry's guidance, they would always have the tools to keep moving forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's the one thing that changed your life in ways you never expected? Share it with us in the comments below. And with that, Mr. Henry knew his mission wasn't over. It had only just begun. The legacy he had started was only the first chapter in a story of transformation, hope, and the power of believing in someone when they needed it the most. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?